Here is your final book for the month. What was the March on Washington? What was the March on Washington? 250,000 Americans streamed into Washington, D.C. from all parts of the country. They came by bus, on trains, on cars, and on motorcycles. Some people walked from New York City, a 230-mile trip that took 11 days. One man even roller skated. They all came in support of a single cause, equal rights for Black Americans. By gathering together, they were shining light on the terrible problem of racism in the United States. What is racism? Racism in America is the belief that among some white people that they are better than Black people, smarter too. It is the belief that Black people do not deserve the same rights that white people have. Despite threats of violence in Washington, people both young and old, Black and white, came to the city. They marched, sang, and listened to speeches, including a very famous one by Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most famous in history. At the time, it was the largest protest ever held in the United States. It led to real changes in our laws and how African Americans live their lives. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it took place on the steamy afternoon of August 28, 1963. The march was held in Washington, D.C. because it is the U.S. Capitol, a city that represents everyone in the country. It is where Congress meets to pass laws, and it is home to the beautiful Lincoln Memorial, which honors the president who helped bring slavery to an end. Slavery ended for African Americans in 1865 after the Civil War, but being set free and being treated as equals to white people are not the same thing. In 1963, almost 100 years later, Blacks still lived lives that were far from equal to whites' lives. Nearly 19 million African Americans lived in the U.S., making up about 10 to 12% of the population. But states and cities had many ways of keeping the races apart or segregating them. In the South, the rules separating blacks from whites were called Jim Crow laws. The name was popularized by a stage show in the 1800s in which a white performer in blackface makeup sang a song about a silly black man named Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws said that blacks could not buy houses in certain neighborhoods. They had to live in less desirable areas. Their public bathrooms were separate, as were sections in theaters and drinking fountains. Some fountains, labeled colored, did not even have cool water. African Americans were not allowed to try on clothes before buying them. Certain public swimming pools and amusement parks were off limits to them, as were certain restaurants and diners. Birmingham, Alabama even banned blacks and whites from playing card games together, as well as dice, dominoes, checkers, baseball, softball, football, basketball, or similar games. In the South, schools and colleges were segregated. So were hospitals, orphanages, funeral homes, cemeteries, and all forms of public transportation. On buses, blacks could only sit in the back and had to give up their seats if white people wanted them. Conditions were better for blacks in the North, but by custom and practice, the races were still mostly segregated there too. Special laws made it difficult for blacks to vote and elect people who would fight for their rights. For instance, in Alabama, black people had to take a reading test with tricky questions before they could sign up to vote. White people did not have to do this. In 1963, it was still against the law in 21 states for a white and black couple to get married. In 1963, America seemed to be split into two different countries, separate and definitely not equal. The jobs open to blacks were usually low-paying: maid, janitor, dishwasher, driver, garbage collector, cotton picker, and tobacco field hand. On TV and in the movies, blacks were portrayed in these same roles. Professional sports teams were segregated too. Modern Major League Baseball teams were all white until Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. Who was that? The Dodgers. He had to promise the team owner he would take insults in silence and ignore hate mail and death threats. What could happen if a black person disobeyed the Jim Crow laws? In 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was beaten to death because he may have whistled at a white woman. And then there was lynching. A lynching was a public hanging that could be imposed for any offense, even an imaginary one. The body would often be left dangling for others to see. Between 1882 and 1963, almost 3,500 blacks were lynched. Without any basic civil rights, it was almost impossible for blacks to fight back. This was normal life, and it did not appear that it would ever change. But by the 1950s, brave African Americans were starting to fight, not with their fists, but through actions that said they were fed up with being treated this way. This kind of protest is called nonviolent civil disobedience. The protesters were deliberately disobeying laws in ways that did not use violence. For instance, groups of black college students would sit at white lunch counters in different southern cities. They knew that they would not be served, but they sat quietly and behaved politely. Most often, the sit-ins ended when police came and dragged them off to jail. It wasn't just young black people who protested. In 1955, a middle-aged seamstress named Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, who we read about a few books ago. She'd refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white person. Right after that, a young preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., told the black people of Montgomery, Alabama to boycott public buses. They should stop riding them and find other ways to get around. The bus boycott lasted more than a year, and it worked. The Supreme Court finally outlawed segregated buses in 1956. For his part in the boycott, King now emerged as a strong national leader. The hottest spot in 1963 was Birmingham, Alabama. King wrote, "Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Sometimes it was called Bombingham. More than 50 bombs had been set off in black homes and churches in the previous 20 years. In May 1963, King and others organized a children's march in which children, some as young as 6 years old, hoped to speak to the mayor of Birmingham about ending segregation. That never happened. Instead, hundreds of students were arrested and jailed. Scenes of cruelty were broadcast on TV, while white adults threw bricks and bottles at the young marchers. The police turned on high-pressure water hoses, the kind used to put out fires. Kids were lifted clear into the air and slammed into the pavement or into buildings. Then the police brought out snarling attack dogs. Many kids thought they were about to die, and several had to be hospitalized. As nothing else had before, the TV images showed viewers all over the country what life was like for blacks in the South. One black minister named Fred Shuttlesworth said, "The whole world is watching Birmingham." 1963 was heating to a boil. Civil rights protests were taking place in many different areas, but not on a national level. It was time for many people to speak with one voice on a national stage in Washington, D.C. A. Philip Randolph, a man long active in the movement to get blacks their civil rights under the law, understood the power of marches. Just before World War II, he'd planned a march in Washington to protest the absence of blacks in the defense industry, which provided well-paying jobs, making things like planes, submarines, and warships. But before the march took place, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met Randolph's demands. Why? First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong supporter of civil rights, but she put pressure on her husband. FDR made it illegal to not hire blacks for defense industry jobs. Randolph again planned to lead a big march in 1948. He hoped to call attention to the fact that the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marines all treated blacks unfairly. Harry Truman was president by then. Just as FDR had done, Truman headed off this march. He signed orders guaranteeing equal opportunities for all races in the military. Randolph's focus had always been on better jobs and better pay for blacks. This went all the way back to his years with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. By the 1920s, being a porter, taking care of overnight passengers on train trips, was one of the best paying jobs open to black men. Yet Randolph saw how unfairly black porters were treated, so he founded the Brotherhood. It was the first time that African Americans had a real labor union, a group speaking on behalf of all its workers. In 1937, after 12 years of struggling for better pay, the Union of Black Porters threatened to go on strike or stop working. As a result, their wages were doubled and job conditions improved. In 1963, A. Philip Randolph was 74 years old, but he was still gutsy and full of passion for civil rights. He wanted a march to actually take place, and on the biggest possible scale. Randolph reached out with letters and phone calls to those in his network of religious leaders, as well as ordinary people. Above all, to make the march happen, he would need the cooperation of all the major civil rights leaders. At first, Randolph got little response from the other leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. They were busy with their own projects, but Randolph would not take no for an answer and kept nudging. While he wooed the leaders, Randolph turned to someone else to work out all the details of the march. Bayard Rustin, who was known as a total genius at organizing. He'd been working for civil rights for 30 years. Born in 1912, Rustin had grown up in West Chester, Pennsylvania. He was a man with strong beliefs. He did not believe in violence, ever. So he did not believe in war, even a war for a good cause. For his refusal to fight in World War II, he served 2.5 years in jail. He was most influenced by Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi was the leader who freed India from British rule. How did he do it? Not by telling people to take up arms and fight the British, but by nonviolence, peaceful resistance. In 1948, India became an independent country. Rustin traveled there to learn more about nonviolence from Gandhi's followers. Later, Rustin became a big influence on Martin Luther King Jr. He believed in peaceful protest too. Bayard Rustin even helped King with some of his speeches. A. Philip Randolph had another ally in the civil rights cause, John F. Kennedy. He was the first Catholic president of the United States. JFK understood what it felt like to be the target of prejudice. When he ran for office in 1960, he spoke about his hope for a United States of America where no one cares what color your skin is. 3 months after he won the election by a very narrow margin, JFK was sending his first package of civil rights laws to Congress. Laws that were promptly watered down by his opponents. Behind the scenes, his brother Robert, the Attorney General, was warning him that the federal government, not the states, had to do something about segregation, or the country would fall into chaos. In May of 1963, a writer named James Baldwin arranged for Robert Kennedy to meet with leading black cultural figures. He listened carefully as they warned of how out of touch the government was, and then reported back to his brother. On June 11, 1963, JFK gave one of the most important civil rights speeches a president had ever delivered. Millions watched on primetime TV. He declared, "The time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise, to make all citizens fully free." He added, "Race has no place in American lives or in American law." 8 days later, JFK presented to Congress the Civil Rights Act of 1963. It called for the government to make certain that blacks could vote, attend integrated public schools, be served in public places, and have the chance for decent jobs, basic human rights. JFK urged Congress to pass the bill quickly for many reasons, but above all, because it is right. The battle was going to be straight uphill. There were no black senators and just 5 black members of the House of Representatives. Randolph had been planning the march for months, but JFK's civil rights bill sped up his timetable. The March on Washington had to happen very quickly. On July 2nd, he announced that it would take place on August 28th. It was to be peaceful and huge, with the goal of at least 100,000 marchers, blacks and whites together, a living petition for the passage of JFK's bill. Randolph brought about a rare display of unity among civil rights leaders. In the end, all of them respected Randolph so much they agreed to make the march work. Most congressmen, even the people who were for civil rights, didn't believe a march would help pass JFK's bill. A senator from South Carolina warned that criminal elements, as well as crackpots, will move in to take every advantage of this mob. Many people were worried about violence. Controlling a crowd that large was going to be very difficult, especially on a hot summer day. Anti-black groups like the American Nazi Party were threatening to show up to protest. To them, civil rights meant the end of America. It is the end of the white race. Even JFK did not approve of the march at first. He argued with the march's leaders. Some of these people in Congress are looking for an excuse to be against us, and I don't want to give them any chance to say, yes, I'm for the bill, but I am darned if I will vote for it at the point of a gun. I switched a word there. Darned was the word. Of course, the marchers would not be carrying guns. What JFK meant was that people don't like to be forced into anything. He thought some members of Congress might view the march as forcing them to vote for the Civil Rights Bill. Randolph and Rustin remained calm and focused. Yes, the risks were high, but this march was going to be a thrilling step for the black people of the United States. They went full steam ahead with their plans. Bayard Rustin had only 2 months to plan what was intended to be the largest peaceful demonstration in American history. His job was to organize a protest on a gigantic scale without cell phones, computers, the internet, or much of the technology we take for granted today. Within days, he had a tentative plan and a core staff of volunteers. They would be in charge of other volunteers around the country. Both his small office in Washington and the main headquarters in the New York City neighborhood of Harlem received bomb threats every day. Rustin doodled on his yellow legal pad, his brain going a mile a minute. Within 2 weeks, lots of pictures. He had a manual and sent it to 2,000 leaders, white and black. It laid detailed groundwork for getting a huge turnout on such short notice. It was a call for action, setting up transportation committees, ways to make the march known, and ways to raise funds. It called for captains aboard every bus, train, and plane. The march was going to cost about $135,000. His staff went after donations from churches, organizations, and individuals. They raised about 2/3 of the money this way. They also sold souvenirs, many thousands of buttons showing a black hand and a white hand clasped together. They held fundraising concerts or hootenannies with folk singers like Joan Baez and a new gravel voice singer named Bob Dylan. Rustin worked as if he were putting together a huge ad campaign for a new product. The flyers his team mailed out began with the words, "An appeal to you." They sent as many as 100,000 a day with local phone numbers to call to sign up. There were spots on radio and TV, interviews on TV talk shows, newspaper and magazine ads, concerts and rallies. Rustin contacted Hollywood celebrities who used their star power to get word out. The day chosen for the march was a Wednesday. It needed to be a weekday. Why? Church groups were planning to come in big numbers, but church groups would not skip their Sunday services. Reverend Abraham Wood said, if we didn't have the crowd, it would be perceived that we would have flunked. Ruston's organizers went to all the major cities to work closely with local leaders to do the hard work of signing up marchers and getting them to Washington. In all, some 1,500 groups across the country helped. How to get all those people to the Capitol? Cars were discouraged as parking would be limited, so Ruston's team began lining up enough buses and trains. How would they keep people comfortable? Memos advised marchers to wear low-heeled shoes and to each bring sunglasses, a hat, and a raincoat. Marchers could bring portable stools, and hundreds of folding chairs were to be supplied for the elderly. What about food? It was okay to bring picnic baskets, box lunches, and thermos bottles of water, but no alcohol. The recommended sandwich was peanut butter and jelly. Sandwiches with mayo were no good. Why? They might go bad in the heat. Churches were encouraged to donate lunches. One New York church packed up 80,000 cheese sandwiches, apples, and slices of marble cake. Hot dogs and other foods would be sold, with large coolers of soda donated by the Coca-Cola Company. Some 20 portable drinking fountains. Portable drinking fountain, that's interesting. Were rented. Bathrooms and first aid. Ruston arranged for nearly 300 portable Johnny-on-the-spot toilets. Oh, those have a name on them. What are they called? It'll come to me. It's not porta potty, but it has a name, you know? Andy Gump. Is that right? I don't know. He planned to set up 22 first aid stations with 40 doctors and 80 nurses on hand. What route should the marchers take? They were not going to pass by Congress on Capitol Hill or the White House. This was a march about freedom, not politics. Instead, they'd walk along the National Mall between two landmarks, from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. These monuments were connected by a reflecting pool almost a half-mile long and a vast lawn. From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, speakers would address the crowd. Ruston planned an afternoon of inspiring speeches by hand-picked speakers. He soothed the egos of those not chosen. Speeches had to be approved in advance and could last no longer than 5 minutes. Ruston wanted the best sound available so the speakers' voices would carry clearly for 1 square mile. Otherwise, the crowd wouldn't pay attention. Along the mall, miles of wires were laid to carry telephone, television, and radio lines. A big concern was how to keep marchers safe. Ruston worked with Washington's police chief. A vast security force was on standby, 8,900 police and firemen, National Guard and Army members and Marines. In case of a riot, they were armed with guns, clubs, and toxic tear gas. 30 helicopters were also on standby, sent to Washington from Fort Bragg. Washington's main hospital had a disaster plan ready. This is pretty intensely planned for. This is pretty good. In addition, Ruston assembled a team of unarmed marshals. They were taught how to control a crowd without force. Also, there would be leaders on every bus to explain to passengers what to do if someone insulted or hit them. They were to ignore it and not fight back. They should leave it to the marshals to respond. There were to be no acts of civil disobedience that could lead to arrest. Over 500 cameramen, technicians, and reporters were to be on hand, with more cameras than had filmed the last presidential inauguration. For a month, the president remained silent about the historic event about to take place in the Capitol. Finally, on July 17th, President Kennedy spoke at a press conference in support of the march. Later, he declined to speak at it, but agreed to meet with the leaders that day. By mid-August, there were no more buses available to rent on the East Coast. All scheduled planes, trains, and buses were filled to capacity. The mall was filled with the sounds of carpenters hammering nails into the speakers' platforms on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Then, on the night before, someone damaged the sound system. Luckily, United States Army sound engineers were able to fix it, working through the night. Up in his hotel room, Martin Luther King Jr. also worked through the night on his speech. The question was, how many people would show up to hear it? I'll end the first video here, but all the pictures that I skipped through, I will show them at the end of video number 2, the final one, which I'm going to record right now as I stop this one and start the next one.